Memphis, December 1968. Elvis Presley had just completed his legendary '68 comeback special, the black leather, the raw power, the reminder to the world that the king could still command a stage. After years of mediocre movies and declining relevance, Elvis was back. And Jimi Hendrix was at the absolute peak of his powers. Electric Ladyland had just been released. He'd blown minds at Monterey Pop. Destroyed Woodstock was still 9 months away, but Jimi was already recognized as the most revolutionary guitarist alive. Two kings of rock and roll, one from the 50s, one from the 60s, one who'd taken black music to white audiences, one who'd taken rock music to places nobody imagined. They'd never met, but in this story, imagine if they had. The fictional meeting happens at American Sound Studio in Memphis, January 1969. Elvis was there recording what would become From Elvis in Memphis, working with producer Chips Moman and the Memphis Boys, reclaiming his musical soul after years of soundtrack albums nobody cared about. Jimi was in Memphis for a break between tours, staying low-key, escaping the pressure of being Jimi Hendrix for a few days. He'd heard Elvis was recording in town, the same city where he'd watched from Tightwad Hill as a poor 14-year-old kid 11 years earlier. Someone, maybe a mutual friend, maybe a producer who thought it would be interesting, arranged for them to meet. Not a publicity stunt, not a photo op, just two musicians in a studio late at night when the session was done and the pressure was off. Picture it. Elvis, 33 years old, fresh off his comeback, wearing his post-special confidence like armor. And Jimi, 26, the revolutionary who changed everything about the electric guitar, suddenly face to face with the man who'd inspired him to pick up the instrument in the first place. "Mr. Presley," Jimi said, extending his hand, always polite, always shy in person despite his explosive stage presence. "Jimi Hendrix," Elvis said, shaking his hand, studying him. "I've heard about you. My daughter's babysitter plays your records. Pretty wild stuff." Not exactly a ringing endorsement. Elvis was never comfortable acknowledging that rock and roll had moved beyond what he'd pioneered. The Beatles, the Stones, the psychedelic movement, he watched it all happen while he was trapped making movies in Hollywood. And Jimi represented everything that had happened while Elvis was away. The experimentation, the feedback, the guitar as a vehicle for sounds Elvis had never imagined. "I watched you perform once. September 1957, Six Stadium in Seattle. I was 14, couldn't afford a ticket, so I watched from a hill outside the stadium." Elvis looked at him differently then. "You watched from outside?" "Too poor to get in," Jimi admitted. "But I could hear you. I wrote down every song you sang that night, drew a picture of you when I got home." Something shifted in Elvis's expression. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Elvis knew poverty. He'd grown up in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. He understood what it meant to be on the outside looking in. "You came a long way from that hill," Elvis said. "So did you," Jimi replied, "from Tupelo to the king." There were guitars in the studio. There always were. Someone, one of the Memphis Boys, or maybe Chips Moman, suggested they play something. "What do you want to hear?" Jimi asked.
Elvis thought about it. "You do all that wild stuff, right? The guitar behind your head, the teeth, the fire?" "Sometimes," Jimi said, "when the moment calls for it." "But can you play it straight?" Elvis asked. "Not aggressive, just curious. The kind of stuff I grew up with. Blues, the real stuff, before all the effects and feedback." It wasn't quite a challenge, but it wasn't not a challenge either. Elvis wanted to see if this revolutionary guitarist could play the fundamentals, the music that had come before the revolution. Jimi smiled that slight smile. "I can try." He picked up an acoustic guitar, not his Stratocaster, not the instrument of psychedelic warfare, just a simple Martin acoustic, the kind you'd find on any blues porch in the Mississippi Delta. And he started playing. What came out of that acoustic guitar was pure, unadulterated blues, not the blues rock Jimi was famous for, not the explosive, effects-laden sound of Purple Haze, just straight Delta blues, the kind that came before electricity, before amplification, before rock and roll. Jimi played Robert Johnson, he played Muddy Waters, he played the blues that had inspired Elvis, the blues that had inspired everyone, the music that was the foundation under everything rock and roll had become. His fingers moved across the strings with a precision that contradicted his wild man stage persona. Every note placed exactly where it needed to be, every bend expressing something wordless but profound. The guitar became a voice, crying and laughing and mourning all at once. Elvis watched, transfixed. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected theatrics, maybe, a demonstration of the pyrotechnics that had made Jimi famous. Instead, he was watching someone honor the roots, show respect to the tradition, prove that all the innovation came from a deep understanding of what had come before. Jimi transitioned into something else, a song Elvis recognized immediately. That's All Right, Arthur Cruduop's blues song that had been Elvis's first single in 1954, the song that had launched his career. But Jimi wasn't copying Elvis's version. He was playing it as a Delta blues, the way it might have been played before Elvis electrified it and made it rock and roll, showing Elvis the roots of his own revolution. When Jimi finished, the studio was quiet. The Memphis boys who'd been watching, the engineers, Chips Moman, everyone was silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. "That," Elvis said finally, "is not what I expected. You asked if I could play it straight. That's as straight as it gets. Everything else, the effects, the feedback, the wild stuff, that all comes from this. If you don't have this foundation, the rest is just noise." "Your turn," Jimi said, offering the acoustic guitar to Elvis. Elvis hesitated. He'd just finished his comeback special, had just reminded the world he could still perform, still had power. But sitting in a studio with Jimi Hendrix, he suddenly felt the weight of the years he'd spent making movies instead of music. "I don't know if I can follow that," Elvis admitted. "You don't have to follow it," Jimi said. "Just show me where it all came from. You're the one who made us all want to do this." So Elvis took the guitar and sang. He sang gospel, the music he'd grown up with in church in Tupelo. Peace in the Valley. His voice, that instrument that could be tender or powerful or both at once, filled the small studio.
No theatrics, no hip shaking, no performance. Just Elvis Presley, stripped down to his essence, singing the music that had formed him before he became the king. Jimi listened with his eyes closed, absorbing it. When Elvis finished, Jimi opened his eyes and said simply, "That's what I was trying to get to that hill in Seattle. That feeling." They talked for hours that night about music, about the burden of fame, about how hard it was to be yourself when the world wanted you to be an icon. Elvis talked about his frustration with the movies, the years he'd spent feeling like a prisoner to Colonel Parker's vision, the relief of the comeback special, finally being allowed to just perform again. Jimi talked about the pressure of being Jimi Hendrix, the expectations that every show had to be more explosive than the last, the exhaustion of always being on. He talked about how sometimes he just wanted to play blues in a small club, but the world demanded spectacle. "You know what the funny thing is?" Elvis said. "I took black music and made it acceptable to white audiences. That's what they say, right? And now you've taken rock and roll, which white kids think belongs to them, and shown them what it can really be in the hands of a black master." "Full circle," Jimi said. "More than that," Elvis replied. "You did what I couldn't. You didn't have to compromise. You didn't have to make it acceptable. You just were yourself, and the world had to catch up." Jimi shook his head. I couldn't have done any of it if you hadn't gone first. You opened the door, made it possible for someone like me to even imagine standing on that stage." Eventually, they plugged in. Jimi got his Stratocaster, that worn, sunburst model that had been with him through Monterey, through Woodstock prep, through countless shows where he'd pushed the instrument to its limits. Elvis grabbed a Gibson, one of the studio guitars, and they started tentatively, feeling each other out. Not for an album, not for an audience. No tape rolling, no cameras, no pressure. Just two musicians at 3 a.m. in Memphis studio, exploring what happened when their styles intersected. Jimi showed Elvis some techniques he'd developed, how to control feedback instead of fighting it, making it musical rather than noise. "You let the guitar sing back to itself," Jimi explained, positioning his Strat at just the right angle to the amp. The sustained note bloomed into overtones, creating harmonics that seemed to come from nowhere. Elvis watched, fascinated. He'd spent his career focused on vocals, using the guitar as accompaniment. But watching Jimi, he saw the guitar becoming the voice itself, singing without words, expressing emotions that language couldn't capture.
Jimi demonstrated the whammy bar, how tiny movements could make a note cry or laugh or scream. "It's like bending your voice," Jimi said. "You know how you can make a word mean different things by how you sing it? The whammy bar does that for guitar notes." Then Elvis took over, showing Jimi something the younger guitarist hadn't quite mastered: phrasing. "It's not about the notes you play," Elvis explained, strumming a simple progression. "It's about the space between the notes, when you breathe, when you pause. That's where the emotion lives." He played a melody, simple, almost childlike in its construction, but the way he shaped it, the tiny delays and accelerations, the way he let certain notes ring while cutting others short, turned simplicity into devastation. "That's what I hear in your voice," Jimi said quietly. "That's what made me cry when I was 14 on that hill. Not the notes, the feeling between them." They started trading off, Jimi playing a blues line, Elvis answering with a vocal melody, then Jimi translating that melody back into guitar, adding his own interpretation. It was a conversation without words, two masters of their crafts finding common language. They played blues, obviously, that was the foundation for both of them. Muddy Waters, Howling Wolf, B.B. King, the architects of everything they'd built. But they also played rock and roll, stripping away the decades of evolution and finding the core of it, the place where blues met country, met gospel, and created something new. Then, around 4 a.m., someone suggested they play gospel. Elvis's face lit up. This was his first love, the music he'd grown up singing in Tupelo's Pentecostal church. "You know how great thou art?" he asked. Jimi knew it, everyone knew it, but hearing Elvis sing it while Jimi played guitar, that was something else entirely. Elvis's voice, still powerful despite the years, soared through the studio. And Jimi's guitar didn't compete, it supported, it enhanced, it created a cathedral of sound for Elvis's voice to inhabit. The Memphis boys had been hanging back, watching, not wanting to intrude on this historic moment. But when Elvis and Jimi launched into a blues shuffle, bassist Tommy Togbill couldn't help himself. He grabbed his bass and jumped in. Then drummer Gene Chrisman, then the others, until the whole studio was alive with the sound of Memphis at its finest. For 3 hours they played. Sometimes it was structured, actual songs they all knew. Sometimes it was pure improvisation, Jimi creating soundscapes, Elvis singing wordless melodies over the top, the Memphis boys laying down grooves that made everything lock into place. It was the kind of magic that happens maybe once in a lifetime, when egos disappear, when competition fades, when it's just musicians connecting at a level beyond technique or fame or anything else. Just pure music, pure joy, pure connection. As dawn approached, they knew the session had to end. Elvis had another day of recording. Jimi had to fly out for the next tour stop.
"You were the real thing," Elvis told him at the door. "What you do with that guitar, I couldn't do that. Wouldn't know where to start." "You started all of it," Jimi replied. "Everything I do, every crazy sound I make, it all traces back to you showing us it was possible. You were the first one to show us that music could be dangerous, could be sexy, could change the world." They shook hands. Two kings of rock and roll, from different eras, different approaches, but connected by the same love of music, the same understanding of what it meant to be more than human in the public eye while trying to stay human in private. "Keep doing what you're doing," Elvis said. "Don't let them turn you into something safe." "Same to you," Jimi replied. "That comeback special, that was you being dangerous again. Stay dangerous." They never saw each other again. Elvis went back to Las Vegas and Memphis, conquering the concert stage again, but never quite escaping Colonel Parker's commercial vision. Jimi had less than 2 years left to live, burning bright and fast before dying in September 1970. But that night in American Sound Studio, two legends met. Two kids who'd grown up poor, one in Tupelo, one in Seattle, and climbed to the top of rock and roll's mountain through sheer talent and determination. This story is fiction. Elvis and Jimi never met, as far as anyone knows. Elvis never acknowledged Jimi publicly. Jimi died before they could cross paths in any documented way. But the fictional meeting tells a truth. These two legends were more connected than the years and the styles suggested. Both grew up in poverty. Both found salvation in music. Both took black musical traditions and did something transformative with them. Elvis bringing it to white audiences in the 50s, Jimi revolutionizing it for everyone in the 60s. Both struggled with the weight of fame. Both felt trapped by expectations. Elvis in his movie contract, Jimi in his wild man persona. Both wanted to just be musicians, but were forced to be icons. And both, in their own ways, changed music forever. If they'd met, they would have recognized each other, not as competitors, but as kindred spirits. Two people who'd been given extraordinary gifts and were trying to figure out how to use them without losing themselves in the process. In our timeline, Elvis died in 1977, 7 years after Jimi. Both died too young, Jimi at 27, Elvis at 42. Both left bodies of work that continue to inspire. But imagine if they'd collaborated. Imagine an album with Elvis's voice and emotional delivery combined with Jimi's revolutionary guitar work. Imagine what they could have created together, the king and the god, finding common ground. It didn't happen, but the fact that we can imagine it, that it could have happened, that it makes sense for these two legends to have connected, that tells us something about how rock and roll works. Every generation builds on what came before. Elvis built on the blues, Jimi built on Elvis and the blues, and everyone since has built on both of them. The fictional meeting in American Sound Studio is just a way of acknowledging that connection, of saying that these weren't competitors or enemies, but fellow travelers on the same musical journey, separated by time, but united by purpose. If this fictional meeting moved you, subscribe for more stories exploring the connections between legends. Share this with someone who loves both Elvis and Jimi, who understands that rock and roll is a conversation across generations. And hit that notification bell for more tales of what could have been and what actually was.